Do you compose orchestral music in a DAW using samples, but struggle to achieve the realism that you want from your sounds? Incorporating dynamics or volume changes into your pieces is essential to achieving a musically interesting sounding piece. In this video, I'll show you how you can tweak various MIDI parameters, including velocities and Midi CCs, to help breathe life into your samples and in turn help take your music to the next level. I'm Simon from Composing Academy, the channel devoted to helping beginning composers get started with writing their own music. If you're looking to kickstart your composing journey, be sure to check out my free beginner's guide to writing cinematic music in 5 easy steps ebook, a link of which is in the description below. Dynamics are essentially volume changes in music. They can be small subtle changes or large abrupt changes, and they help to add feeling and emotion to the notes. Most performers instinctively add subtle dynamics in their playing, in order to bring a heightened sense of musicality and expressiveness to the music they're playing. When working with samples, we also need to add these dynamics, much in the same way a performer would, in order to create music which is full of emotion and life. In DAWs such as Cubase or Logic, these dynamic changes can be achieved in 2 ways. For short staccato notes like percussion or spiccato strings, we can tweak what we call the velocity of each note. For longer notes played by instruments such as violins or brass instruments, we can use what are called MIDI controller changes, or MIDI CCs, to help add dynamics. In the world of MIDI, velocity refers to how hard or soft a note is pressed on a MIDI controller, such as a keyboard. Sample library developers will generally assign louder samples of an instrument to a high velocity, and quieter sounds to a low or soft velocity. When you play a real instrument, such as a drum, the tone or timbre drastically changes according to how hard or soft you play that instrument. Imagine hitting that drum softly. You'll get a quiet, almost timid sound with not much impact. Hit that drum hard though, and you'll get a sound which is not only louder, but also has a lot more bite or impact like this. The changes in dynamics are not just about changes in volume, they affect the tone or timbre of the instrument as well. Changing the velocities can be useful in 2 ways. Firstly, when playing a rhythm or musical line, a performer will often try to keep a consistent sound between each note they play. No matter how good they are though, they are human and not a machine, so there will inevitably be some variations in the volume of repeated notes. Changing each note's velocity by a very small amount can help give your music this human lifelike quality. Secondly, adding accents, or louder individual notes to a part, can help create more interest in the music as well. An accented pattern sounds a lot more interesting than, say, just a pattern which stays at the same volume and consistency the whole way through. To demonstrate these 2 concepts, I have this percussion part which I've written in Cubase. Both passages are exactly the same musically, except the first one has changing velocities, and the second one is just all the same velocity. Let's take a listen to both. You can hear how the first example is a lot more interesting compared to the static nature of the second example. In just about every DAW, such as Cubase or Logic, there are 2 main ways to achieve variations with your velocities. The first is to play them in using a MIDI controller, such as a keyboard. You can try to achieve a performance with different velocities by making sure you vary how hard or soft you hit the keys. The second way is to go in and draw or edit velocities in your DAW's MIDI editor. Here in Cubase, it has some handy functions for tweaking velocities. You can either use the pencil tool to go in and draw or change velocities like this, or you can select multiple notes and play with the various handles which then appear around the selection. Clicking on this middle handle will scale the velocities up and down, keeping the same proportionate changes between each note, but either at a higher or lower value. You can also compress or expand the relative velocity changes using this handle on the right hand side of each selection. For longer, more sustained instruments, we can use continuous controllers, or Midi CCs for short, to help shape the dynamics. Continuous controllers offer lots of different ways to tweak the sounds, including volume, sustain pedal, and adding vibrato. For dynamics, the two which are most useful are modulation, which is CC1, and expression, which is CC11. Let's start with modulation, or the mod wheel as it's sometimes described. Sample library developers will often assign CC1, or modulation, to an instrument's dynamic layers. Just like with velocities, playing a long sustained note on an instrument softly will produce a soft tone or timbre. Play that same note with more energy though, like bowing a violin with more force, and it will produce a tone which is more aggressive and intense, as well as being louder. This change in tone is what sample library developers call dynamic layers. Listen to this violin sustained note, firstly with the modulation fader turned all the way down. As I gradually increase the fader, the sound achieves more intensity as well as volume. So again, it's not just changing the volume, but also the timbre of the sound. For added realism, it also helps to have an additional continuous controller working in tandem with modulation as well. The expression controller, or CC11, is used as a volume controller. Whereas CC1 helps fade between the different dynamic sample layers, the expression controller only controls volume. In Cubase, you can call up any continuous controller by clicking this small plus sign down in the bottom left-hand corner of the key editor. You'll want to have both the modulation and expression lanes open at the same time, so select modulation first, and then do the same again and add the expression lane. To enter controller data, again you can record it using a MIDI controller. Most keyboards have knobs or faders which can be programmed, or you can either use a separate controller like the one I have here. Like with velocities, you can also use the pencil tool to draw data in. The line tool in Cubase is also an extra way which can be useful for drawing smooth curves like this. Here I had some string chords, and let's first hear them without any modulation or expression data. You can hear how they sound pretty static with no dynamic movement. I'm going to record some modulation and expression data using my faders to add more movement and emotion to the sound. I'm going to aim to have a crescendo for one bar and decrescendo for the next, repeating this pattern throughout. Okay, so that's a quick rundown of using dynamics with samples and how they can be used to elevate your music. Have a go at composing an orchestral piece and experiment with both tweaking the velocities for any short notes and then modulation and expression for long sustained notes. Try and listen before and after you make any changes so you can hear the difference in the realism of your music after you've added dynamics. As always, if you've enjoyed the video, make sure you subscribe and click the bell to be notified every time I release a new video. If you have any questions, feel free to ask in the comments below as well.